Good afternoon, and thank you all of you for joining our webcast this afternoon to learn more about the Lobbyists Transparency Act. My name is Michael McAvoy, and I'm the Registrar for Lobbyists in BC. And maybe that's a good point to say and add just a little clarification that I'm actually the regulator. I'm not the lawmaker. We can perhaps explain a little bit about the rationale for the law, but of course, I and my team don't make it, but our job is to ensure that it's applied in a fair and judicious way across the province. Before I begin, I want to extend my thanks to Alison Bruin, who I've known for many years. And Alison first suggested that we do this live webcast. And I also want to thank all of you for reaching out to get your questions answered. And to those of you who've assisted in providing feedback on our guidance for nonprofits, we very much appreciate that. I'd also like to acknowledge the ORL staff who have joined me today, oline Twiss, who's our Deputy Registrar, and Morag Ross, who's the Registry and Compliance Manager for the ORL. I thought it was important that you be able to put some names to their faces, as you will no doubt probably want to connect with them with questions or comments, whether that's today or in the coming months. And of course, they're there to help. And I'm sure probably a number of you have already been in contact with either Oline or Morag, and you found that we're pretty accessible. There'll be time for questions at the end of the webinar. So if you hold those, and we will deal with them at the conclusion, and know there'll probably be a number. We know this process will be new to many of you, but we do think it's a system that will become second nature to you fairly quickly. As my deputy, Oline Twiss, likes to say, it's like riding a bike. Once you get on and get the hang of it, it's pretty straightforward. Do know that, again, we're here to support you with guidance and tools to ease your compliance with the new regulations. And please don't hesitate to contact our office with any questions you might have following this meeting. I also wanted to let you know this session is being recorded, so you can come back to our website and listen again anytime. So today we're here to talk about the changes that led to the Lobbyists Transparency Act, or LTA. That's the legislation that's now in place. BC's first lobbyist legislation was entitled the Lobbyists Registration Act, or LRA, which was enacted back in 2003. It was introduced to bring transparency to the very legitimate activity of lobbying, an important part of our democracy. A strong democracy is built on transparency of who is attempting to influence government, whether it's a for-profit business or not. By employing lobbyists or conducting lobbying activity, individuals and organizations can ensure that their concerns or positions are heard by government, and they can attempt to have those concerns addressed. But it's important to remember that lobbying legislation is about revealing who is talking to who. So since its inception in 2003, there have been a few significant changes to BC's lobbyist legislation. In 2010, the registry moved online, making it accessible to the public and to lobbyists on a 24/7 basis. More recently, the Lobbyist Registration Amendment Act, that was in 2018, brought in a number of important amendments. Amongst them, they changed the name of the act to the LRA, the Lobbyist Transparency Act, when it was introduced on May the 4th, 2020. One of the key changes ushered in by the LTA is that lobbyists are now required to report lobbying activities on a monthly basis. This requirement aligns with federal Canadian lobbying rules, which will streamline registrations for some lobbyists. The other significant change involves the removal of the 100-hour threshold. Under the LRA, organizations and consultant lobbyists could lobby up to 100 hours before being required to register. Under the LTA, that threshold has been removed. As a result of this change, some organizations that did not previously need to register their lobbying activities now must register. That may apply to a number of you. It's all part of the transparency piece. So now, instead of tracking your activities to determine whether you have reached 100 hours, you now simply need to track them in the registry. All organizations, including unions, social service groups, and other non-governmental organizations, as well as private sector groups, are all affected by this change. There are a handful of very narrow exceptions to this, which will be addressed by Oline in a few minutes. By and large, however, it covers most organizations now in the province that lobby. I've been asked several times, why does a charity like ours that exists to do good work need to be burdened by this requirement? Aren't these new rules meant to catch the bad actors in the private interest lobbying? And again, I would emphasize this. It's not about good or bad actors. It's simply a question of transparency and ensuring that the public understand who is trying to influence who in government. As I mentioned, these changes came into force on May 4th, 2020. So if you're lobbying, you should be registered by now. But as you know, I extended the period for lobbyists to transition to the new registry to September 15th, 2020, for those organizations impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And a few of those organizations have talked to us, and we understand their situation. So as long as they are tracking, if you happen to be one of them, as long as you're tracking your activities from May 4th to September 15th and are prepared to submit them by that date, everything is in order. So now seems like a good time to mention penalties. The work of our office, I need to emphasize, is for the most part administrative and educational. And that's the way in giving guidance to organizations. And for the most part, that is the way we do in the majority of our work. But unless common circumstances, enforcement of the law is required. Under the LTA, my office can issue administrative penalties of up to $25,000 if, after an investigation, an individual is found non-compliant. I consider these fines to be a very last resort. We have many guidance documents available, and we're happy to help organizations in understanding their compliance requirements. I should note that the highest fine to date that I've issued has been $5,000. Fines are measured, but they can escalate if a lobbyist has had previous enforcement actions against them. The guidelines we use to determine the amount of a fine are in our guide to investigations posted on our website, so it's very clear there. I can also prohibit a non-compliant individual or organization from lobbying for up to 2 years. And I'm required by statute to publicly report when I find a lobbyist is offside of the law. You can find those reports published on our website. I'm really glad all of you joined us today to learn about how to remain compliant with the LTA. And I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you this afternoon. Today, we will focus on two main topics. First, how do you know if you are lobbying and if those activities need to be registered? Second, what do you need to submit to the registry and how do you submit it? At the end of our session, our team will be pleased to take your questions. And now to detail the answers to those questions that I've raised, I'd like to turn things over to Oline Twiss, our Deputy Registrar, who will talk about how you can tell if you are actually lobbying. Oline.
Hey, thank you, Commissioner and Registrar McAvoy. As the Commissioner said, my name is Oline Twiss. I'm the Deputy Registrar of Lobbyists. And certainly I know, and we all know, that the work that you do every day is really important for all of us. So thank you for the work that you do and for taking the time today to join us to gain a better understanding of the rules for registering lobbying activities under the Lobbyists Registration Act, or the LTA, as I'll also call it. So the easiest way to understand whether your organization needs to register its lobbying activities is to first understand what counts as lobbying under the Act. And then you want to understand what kinds of lobbying activities do not need to be registered. And what remains there are likely the lobbying activities that your organization does need to register in the Lobbyists Registry. So I'm going to spend my time talking about two things. First, we're going to review what lobbying is under the LTA. And then I'm going to address areas that are most relevant to nonprofits, where the LTA says that an organization would not need to submit its lobbying activities to the registry. And these are all cases where an exception or an exclusion applies under the Act. So let's start with what is lobbying. Lobbying is defined under the LTA. You can see that the Act defines it as any communication with a public office holder that attempts to influence decisions that are being made. The key words there are a communication with a public office holder, and you are attempting to influence any one of a number of enumerated things. And I'll just take a pause here to note that public office holders are not just elected MLAs. Under the Act, it also includes ministers and anyone that's working at any level of government or a crown corporation or a provincial entity. So the definition includes communications to influence legislation, regulations, programs, policies, contracts, grants, funding, or financial benefits. So if you are communicating with a public office holder and you're doing any of these listed activities, then you are likely lobbying. And that means you need to consider whether those activities need to be registered. The question we often get, of course, from many nonprofits is, are my organization's advocacy activities lobbying? And our answer is always, if your advocacy activities are any of the activities listed in the definition of lobbying, then yes, they are lobbying. So you can take a look at the definition again. It's set out in Section 1 of the Act, and we review it in a lot of our guidance documents. And that's what you want to turn to establish whether or not your communications are lobbying. And if they are, then the LTA requires organizations to register those activities, unless the Act sets out an exception or an exclusion. So I'm going to turn now to 3 areas where exceptions and exclusions may apply. And the instances in which lobbying activities do not need to be submitted are: one is unpaid lobbying. Another is organizations that meet what I'm going to refer to as the micro lobbying requirements, which have limits. And a third is any of the what are known as oral and written submission exclusions that apply under Section 2.2 of the LTA. And there are 5 of those that I'm going to review for you today. So starting with unpaid lobbying. The LTA requires that an organization's lobbying activities need only be submitted to the registry if the lobbyists are paid for their functions. And you can see in the language here, an in-house lobbyist is an employee, officer, or director of an organization who receives payment for functions and who lobbies. And for consultant lobbyists, similar language, they're lobbying for payment. In other words, if you are paid in your nonprofit job and you lobby in that capacity, then you likely need to submit those lobbying activities to the registry. For people at nonprofit organizations, some people at nonprofit organizations are not paid. And an example of that is that it's not uncommon for nonprofits to have volunteer board members. If board members are volunteers, then they can engage in lobbying on behalf of the organization without being required to submit those lobbying activities to the registry. But obviously, the volunteer needs to be a genuine volunteer. So a board member that receives a significant honorarium for carrying out functions that are understood to include that lobbying would not likely be considered a true volunteer. And similarly, an executive director who says that they volunteer their time to lobby for their organization after work hours would not be considered a volunteer. And if an ED were to draft a letter and ask a board member who is a volunteer just to sign off on it in order to avoid the lobbyist registry requirements, that's not something that would be consistent with what we think the Act requires organizations to do. Sometimes an employee of a nonprofit organization will sit on the board of another organization as part of their duties. And we've been asked in a case like this if lobbying for the other organization has to be declared. And the answer is yes. If you are paid in your duties at your own organization to lobby for another organization, then those activities would need to be submitted in the registry. And the registration that you would submit them under depends on whether you're lobbying for your own organization or for the other organization. So you may be registered as a lobbyist for more than one organization. Moving on to the next area, where lobbying would not have to be submitted to the registry. This is what I'll call the micro lobbying exclusion. It does have limits, but it's contained in Section 1.4 of the LTA. This section says that an individual is excluded from being a lobbyist for an organization if they meet all of the following requirements. So first, you can see They have to be an employee, director, or officer of an organization that has fewer than 6 employees. Second, the lobbying by the individual on behalf of the organization or an affiliate of the organization totals fewer than 50 hours in the preceding 12-month period. And last, the primary purpose of the organization is not to represent the interests of its members or to promote or oppose issues. If you meet all 3 of these requirements, then this micro-lobbying exclusion with its limits would apply to your organization, which means that you would not need to register your lobbying activities. Despite this exception, though, the reality is even small community service organizations with less than 6 employees and less than 50 hours of lobbying will be required to register if their primary purpose is to represent the interests of their members or to promote or oppose issues. So that's something that you need to be alive to. And if that's the case, then an organization like that would have to register their activities. If you want to learn more about this exception, it's set out in detail in our guidance documents, in our guidance document for nonprofit organizations, which is on our website. The third area that I'm going to talk about, where the LTA states that organizations do not need to submit lobbying activities to the registry, is in cases where the LTA explicitly says the Act does not apply. And the section most relevant for nonprofits here is Section 2.2, which says that the LTA does not apply for certain types of oral and written submissions. I'm going to run through 5 of them. So example 1 you can see here. It's an oral or written submission that does not have to be declared in the registry if your organization makes those submissions and they're already a matter of public record to a committee of the Legislative Assembly or to a body with statutory powers. So this means if your organization is lobbying for changes to a statute, and you do that by making submissions or by being a witness at a legislative committee that's reviewing the statute, then you do not need to submit those activities to the lobbyist registry. Example 2 of where the LTA does not apply if your organization is making an oral or written submission is to an MLA on behalf of a member's constituent with respect to that constituent's personal matter. So this may apply to those nonprofits that provide services and for whom advocacy on behalf of a client is part of those services. Note that the submissions about the personal matter must be to the constituent's MLA, not to the MLA of the organization. Example 3 of where the LTA does not apply if your organization makes a written or oral submission to a public office holder is when it happens in direct response to a written request from a public office holder for advice or comments and any matters set on any of the matters that are set out in the definition of lobbying. So that's the definition that I showed you earlier. This exclusion permits public office holders to reach out to organizations as needed to seek their expertise and input. It supports all public office holders in carrying out their business, whether it's of government or as a member of the BC legislature or another public office holder, such as a Crown corporation. And if your organization is tapped in a circumstance like this because of your expertise, then we recommend that you keep a copy of the written communication from the public office holder. Keep it on record because that's what we would ask you to produce for us were we ever to be looking into a question of compliance with respect to those communications. Example 4 of where the LTA does not apply with respect to an oral or written submission is if that submission is made on behalf of your organization by an individual in relation to the public office holder's enforcement, interpretation, or application of any act or regulation. So if there, for example, is an issue with your nonprofit's registration papers under the Societies Act and the appropriate authority has raised that with you, then your communications with them to perhaps influence their thinking that you have in fact met those requirements would not be considered lobbying and would not have to be registered. And the last example of where the LTA does not apply that I'm going to talk about is when an oral or written submission is made to an individual on behalf of a person or organization in relation to the public office holder's implementation or administration of a program, policy, directive, or guideline. So consider a situation where your organization is assisting a woman fleeing abuse and that client is seeking your assistance in applying for access to the services available through the BC Employment and Assistance Program. In this case, your organization's oral and written submissions to the ministry, in this case, it would be the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction, on behalf of your client would not be considered lobbying because A, the ministry has policies on fleeing abuse and accessing the Employment Assistance Program services, and B, your communications with the ministry would arguably relate to the administration or implementation of those policies with respect to your client. So those are a few of the examples of where the LTA does not apply when it comes to oral and written submissions. A quick review: they're made to a committee of the Legislative Assembly, or they're made to an MLA regarding a personal matter of their constituent, or they're made in response to a written request from a public office holder, or made to a public office holder on behalf of a person or organization concerning the enforcement, interpretation, or application of any act or regulation, or they're made to a public office holder on behalf of a person or organization concerning the implementation or administration of any program, policy, directive, or guideline. Those communications to public office holders are all exempt from the application of the LTA, which means they do not need to be submitted to the registry. So to conclude, in order to know whether you need to register your lobbying activities, you first want to identify whether you're engaged in any of the activities set out in the definition of lobbying. And if you are, then you want to consider whether your organization's lobbying activities are subject to an exception or exclusion. And if they are not, then you would be required to register your organization's lobbying activities in the Lobbyist Registry. So once you familiarize yourself with what lobbying is and which lobbying activities need to be registered, then you'll find yourself logged into our Lobbyist Registry to submit the relevant information. And I really encourage everybody to do this sooner than later if you haven't had a chance to do it yet. Don't wait until the week or 2 weeks before. We're a small team and we work hard to answer everyone's questions. And it's really great to give yourself time to work through them as you go along. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our registry manager, who's going to review what and how to register. Morag.
Thank you, Oline. My name is Morag Ross, and I am the Registry and Compliance Manager, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to review how to register in the Lobbyist Registry and the information that lobbyists need to include in the Lobbyist Registry. Now, there are two types of returns required by the Lobbyists Transparency Act. There's your registration return and your monthly return. Your registration return contains information about your organization, its lobbyists, and the lobbying you intend to do. Your monthly return contains information regarding the lobbying you actually did in the previous month. This is where you declare your actual lobbying of senior public office holders you did in the previous month. Organizations have 5 days to file a registration return after the date the organization first lobbies. So 10 days to register after the date the organization first communicates with a public office holder for the purpose of influencing any of the matters referenced in the definition of lobby. The definition for public office holder is defined in the Lobbyists Transparency Act and includes ministers, MLAs, and anyone at any level working for government, a crown corporation, or a provincial entity. Before you can sign into the registry to create your registration return, you will need to create an account. I'm going to review how to do that, and this information is also available on our website. We have a number of user guides that explain how to use the registry that can be found on our website in the section titled Using the Registry. When you first access the registry, this is a landing page that you will see. To create an account, you simply click on the Sign In button at the top right of the screen. From this page, at the bottom right of the screen, you will click on the Create an Account button. Once you have gone through the process of creating an account, you will sign in with your username and password on this page. And once you have signed in, you will be on your personalized dashboard. To create a new registration return for your organization, you will look under the New Activities tab and choose Organization from the registration types. You can't see them on the page, but you'll see them when you scroll down. Once you click on Organization, you will be able to start entering information into your registration return. There are 7 steps to completing your registration return. You can complete the steps in order if you want, going from step 1 to 2 and so on, or you can jump around and fill them out of order if you want as well. You can also save your work and come back to it later. I won't go through all 7 steps today, but you can see that the registry is very straightforward and walks you through each question. We have a frequently asked questions section on our website with many helpful questions that may assist you as you register. We also have a number of guidance documents on our website on matters such as provincial entities, government funding, and one specifically for organizations that will assist you to complete your registration return. Earlier this week, we also posted a guidance document specifically for nonprofit organizations. And there are links to these guidance documents right in the registry. For example, on step 5 of 7, government funding, you can click on the link that takes you to the government funding guidance document on our website. And we have received a number of questions on government funding from nonprofits. So I'll take a moment now to answer some of those questions. Organizations are required to declare in their registration return both the government funding your organization has requested in the past 12 months and the government funding your organization has actually received in the past 12 months. Also, if you have made a request for funding and no decision has been made, you just report the request for funding in the registry, and that stands until a decision is made and funds are received. Keep in mind that you must declare funding requested and received from any level of government, Canadian or foreign governments, including any municipal, provincial, territorial, regional, or state government. Now, returning back to the process of completing your registration return, once you have completed all 7 sections of your registration return, you must click on the Proceed to Certification button on the bottom right of the organization summary page to certify and submit your registration return. To certify and submit your registration return, you must enter the date your lobbying activities first began for your organization and your username and password. And once you have submitted your registration return, you can complete your first monthly return. And the monthly return requirement includes 4 things. First, a lobbying activity report, which reports on the lobbying of senior public office holders for the previous month. For example, any phone calls, emails, texts, letters, and meetings. Second, a declaration of any political, sponsorship, or recall contributions an in-house lobbyist has made to an MLA they are lobbying. Third, a declaration of any gifts or other benefits the in-house lobbyist or organization gave or promised to give to any public office holder since your last monthly return. And fourth, ensuring your registration return is up to date. Before I address each of these in detail, I will address the question of when the monthly return is due. Organizations are required to file their monthly return by the 15th of every month, beginning the month after the registration return is first filed. For example, if you file your registration return on May 10th, you have until June 15th to file your first monthly return. If you first lobby on May 29th and file your registration return on June 5th, you would have until July 15th to file your first monthly return. Now let's look more closely at the lobbying activity report. This is where you enter information about your lobbying communications with senior public office holders in the previous month. To complete a lobbying activity report from your dashboard, click on the Add New button under Current Activities. You must file a lobbying activity report for each lobbying activity of senior public office holders that you carry out. Here's a screenshot of the first of 4 steps in the registry. Your lobbying activity report must include the name and position title of the senior public office holder or holders who was the object of the lobbying activity and where they work. That is the name of the ministry or provincial entity. Note that only those lobbying activities directed at a senior public office holder must be declared in your lobbying activity report. and senior public office holders are a subset of public office holders and are defined in the Lobbyists Transparency Act to include MLAs and staff of MLAs, ministers and staff of ministers, parliamentary secretaries, deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers, as well as the senior and next most senior ranking executive position in a provincial entity, and the chair and vice chair of the governing body of a provincial entity. Other details you must include in your lobbying activity report are the date of the lobbying activity and details to identify the subject matter of the lobbying activity. The subject matter section requires you to provide a clear and concise description of your lobbying activities, so anyone looking at the registry can easily identify and understand your lobbying goals. Organizations must include also in their monthly report the names of the in-house lobbyists for their organization who participated in each lobbying activity reported. And finally, like the registration return, you must certify and submit your lobbying activity report on step 4 of 4. One question we are getting about lobbying activity reports is, do I have to file a monthly report in a month where I did not do any lobbying for my organization? The answer is no. Subsection 4.25 of the LTA says that a monthly return is not required if no lobbying activity occurred in a month. However, note that you would still be required to update your registration return in a month that you have not lobbied if any of the information in your registration return has changed. Let's now look at the requirements for declaring contributions as they relate to elections activity. These are declared in the registration return. And when you complete your monthly return, you must confirm that these answers are correct and up to date. To promote transparency, the legislation requires lobbyists to declare in their monthly return whether or not they have made any of the following 3 kinds of contributions. Political contributions as defined in BC's Election Act, sponsorship contributions as defined in BC's Election Act, and recall contributions defined under BC's Recall and Initiative Act. Political contributions include contributions made to an MLA you have lobbied or to that MLA's political party or constituency association. They are an amount of money or value of property or services provided, with some exceptions such as for volunteer services. Sponsorship contributions are when a contribution has been made to a third-party sponsor for the purpose of sponsoring election advertising. So these contributions have been made indirectly to an MLA that you have lobbied or to that MLA's political party. But that third-party sponsor in turn sponsors election advertising that promotes the election of a candidate that you are now lobbying. And recall contributions are contributions towards a petition to recall an MLA, and lobbyists must declare them in the registry where the recall is in relation to an MLA they are lobbying. The relevant period to consider in declaring one of these contributions is from the date the writ was issued for the last provincial election, April 11th, 2017, to the date of filing the monthly return. So a lobbyist will have to declare whether they have made any of these 3 contributions from April 11th, 2017, and the date they are filing their monthly return. This step in completing a monthly return is an easy checkbox. Filers simply indicate yes or no as to whether they have made one of these reportable contributions in relation to a lobbying activity. The lobbyist legislation does not require any other details about the contributions to be submitted to the registry. And now let's delve into the third requirement of monthly returns, gifts. The legislation, the LTA, prohibits a lobbyist from giving or promising to give, directly or indirectly, any gift to any public office holder the lobbyist is lobbying. There is an exception. A gift can be given to a public office holder if 2 requirements are satisfied. First, the gift is given or promised under the protocol or social obligations that normally accompanies the duties or responsibilities of the office of the public office holder. And second, the total value of gifts given or promised is less than $100 in a 12-month period. Noting here that even if your gift to a public office holder meets the exception, the legislation requires the gift to be declared in the registry. Gifts given or promised under the protocol or social obligations that normally accompany the duties or responsibilities of the office of the public office holder includes things like a token of gratitude when you have a public office holder attend a conference or event as a keynote speaker. For example, giving a mug as a gift of appreciation to a minister or deputy minister that speaks at a conference organized by your organization likely meets the exception, and the value of the mug would need to be declared in the registry. Gifts can also include meals or beverages. We've received lots of questions on this. The answer to those questions is often that it depends. If an MLA that you are lobbying is delivering a lunchtime keynote at your conference, then offering them lunch would likely be permitted as per the exception. And you would still have to declare the value of the lunch in the registry. Keep in mind, the LTA talks about giving or promising to give a gift directly or indirectly. As such, if you had someone external to your organization give a gift to a public office holder your organization is lobbying, your organization would need to declare this gift given indirectly in the registry. Our online guidance addresses everything from receptions and luncheons to token gifts and complimentary tickets. I encourage you to review it, and if you have any questions, please contact us. The fourth requirement to complete your monthly return is straightforward. Lobbyists will be required to make any updates to their registration return when they file a monthly return. The registry has been designed to prompt you to turn your mind to this whenever you submit a monthly return. Thank you for your time. Now I believe we have some time for some questions.
Okay. I think what I'll do is we'll start by just publishing the questions that we're looking at, and I've just publishing one here, which is a good question that we've gotten a few times. The question is, does the executive director of our nonprofit need to register in order to episodically communicate with our local MLA at occasional community events or functions throughout the year? Does communicating or updating on organizational activities equal lobbying? So this is a good question, and it goes back to that definition of lobbying as set out under the Act. If you're just providing information, then it wouldn't be lobbying. However, if the ED, for example, takes the opportunity at the community event to try to influence that MLA on a matter that is any of the matters set out in the definition of lobbying, then that is something that the organization would need to register. So really it's about understanding when are you engaged in lobbying itself and when are you not. Information sharing alone is not sufficient. You really need to be communicating with a public office holder in an attempt to influence one of the matters set out in the definition of lobbying.
Thanks for that, oline. And I realized at the time when I was looked like I was doing mime. I had muted myself, unfortunately. So I apologize. I apologize to everybody for that. So thanks for that. And we'll continue on. We've got many more questions, oline.
Okay, so I will answer the next question here. And it's a question about the exemption for organizations that Oline laid out in her presentation today. And it says, for exemptions, is it less than 6 employees? Is this 6 full-time employees or 6 individuals? So that's a great question. We've had that question a few times from many different organizations. And the answer it is 6 individuals. So even if you had an employee who worked 1 hour a week, that would be considered 1 employee.
Mm-hmm. And the language in the statute is fewer than 6 employees. So it would mean 5 or fewer employees. Okay. Another question here, which goes to the actual registry itself. Who can see the lobbying activity reports? So the way that the Lobbyists Transparency Act is set up, the registrar is responsible both for maintaining the registry of lobbying activities and for education and enforcement related to it. So everything that you submit into the lobbyist registry is visible to the public. And you can go onto our website now and you can search the registry, and you'll see there are all sorts of ways to search. You can search by name, you can search by of the lobbyist, you can search by organization, you can search by topic. You won't be surprised to see there that one of the most popular topics right now for lobbying activities is COVID-19. And we've been really fortunate because we have built our registry on the backbone of the federal system, and it has a really good search functionality, which means that the information that's in there is very accessible to the public, and that serves to fulfill the transparency purpose of the Act that the registrar talked about.
So we have another question here about, the question is, are nonprofits unfettered from freely communicating with municipal councils and mayors? So again, this is another good question. And BC's legislation, the Lobbyists Transparency Act, does not apply to municipalities. Some municipalities do have their own lobbying legislation that you may want to be aware of, so you can contact those municipalities individually to find that out, but you don't have to declare any lobbying activities that you do directed at a municipality in the BC Lobbyist Registry.
And another question that I'm looking at here relates to the transition between the Lobbyist Registration Act to the Lobbyists Transparency Act. And that question is, oh, I just lost it. Where did it go? If I remember correctly, the question was related to the 100-hour threshold. So if you previously, under the Lobbyist Registration Act, were not lobbying more than 100 hours, then you didn't have to register. But once the Lobbyist Transparency Act came into effect, which was on May 4th of 2020, then from that point forward, that's when you need to be registering your lobbying activities. So if you haven't done it yet, as the registrar said, the sort of drop dead date for the transition period is September 15th. And you should put everything from May 4th to September 15th when you register. And then after that, it's on a monthly basis. So for example, as Morag talked about, all of your lobbying activities for this month in August need to be registered by the 15th of September. And then all of your lobbying activities in the month of September need to be registered by the 15th of October. So you're doing it on a monthly basis from there on out.
Here's another question. I'll just read it and then I'll publish it so you can see it. It says, if your lobbying activity now comes under the Act, how do you define the date that the lobbying started, if this has been a consistent activity over a number of years? So another good question, and one we've had a few times. So this is a question of an organization that has been lobbying previously, but was under the 100-hour threshold, so was not required to register in the past. As of May 4th, 2020, they're now required to register. So the question is, when I complete my registration return and you ask me, when did my lobbying start, what date do I put? So the answer to that question is you should put May 4th, 2020 as your start date, because that's the date you're first required to register in the lobbyist registry. And you'll report any of your lobbying activities of senior public office holders starting on May 4th, 2020.
Okay, the next question here is about political contributions. And the question is, let me see, do I need to declare a contribution to a political party, a personal contribution, membership contribution? The answer to that is yes, you do. And some details about political contributions and the requirement to declare them in the Act. It is simply that, a declaration, as Morag had said. So what we mean by that is you're only indicating in the Act yes or no whether you made one. The registrar is not required to collect any information about who you made it to. It's simply a yes or no question from the point that you're answering the question back to the date of the last writ drop for the last provincial election. Did you make a political contribution? So a contribution as a member to a political party would count. You indicate yes, and the answer would stay yes until the next writ drop, at which point the registry will refresh that question and everybody will have to proactively indicate again whether or not they have made a political contribution since the new writ drop date.
So here's another question about registration, and this is the question reads: we are working with a GR firm, a government relations firm. Sounds like they have employed consultant lobbyists. They are in touch with the public office holder on our behalf, but we ourselves have not engaged any public office holders. Am I correct that we do not need to report their activity on our behalf in our monthly report? So again, this is also a common question that I've received before. So this is a question where you have in-house lobbyists for your organization, and you've also employed a consultant lobbyist, or sometimes more than one consultant lobbyist, to lobby on behalf of your organization. The answer is you don't need to report on your consultant lobbyists' lobbying activities. That's their responsibility. You only need to report on what you are doing, what your in-house lobbyists are doing in your registration return and in your monthly returns.
Yeah, I'm going to answer a couple here because one of them is a quick one, but a very good question. Does anybody need to pay to register as a lobbyist? And the answer is no, it's entirely free. There's no cost for doing that. And that's part of promoting the transparency of lobbying activities in the province. Another question here is related to coalitions. So it says we are a coalition of over 110 member organizations, including not-for-profits, community groups, unions, etc. Is each member group also required to register in addition to our coalition? So this is a really good question, then, because the Act also contains special provision on coalitions, and we have some guidance on our website, which I invite you to take a look at. But the answer to that question is, if the coalition itself is doing the lobbying, then when the coalition registers, it will be required to name all of the members of the coalition within its lobbying registration. However, any one of those members may be doing their own lobbying on different matters, or even the same matters that the coalition itself is doing lobbying activities for. So any of those members could also feasibly have their own registration where they're logging and submitting their ongoing lobbying activities as well.
Another question here is whether the person being lobbied also has to report. So there would be a cross-reference record. The answer to that question is no. The public office holder who's being lobbied does not have to report anything to us.
Okay. And another question here about whether there is a connection between the provincial lobbying registry and the federal lobbying registry. There isn't a connection between the two registries. You can't go in, for example, and search them both at the same time. However, as I mentioned, we have licensed the core of the federal registry to build ours. And that primarily is because when government introduced the recent amendments to the Act, the introduction of monthly reporting requirements was the core of those amendments, and the federal system already has monthly reporting requirements. So those of you who do submit to the federal registry will find it feels familiar, the registry in BC now, because it has many of the same functions that the federal registry has, but they are not interconnected with one another. They're independent registries, both managed by an office at the federal level, and ours, of course, by the British Columbia Commissioner and Registrar.
So there's another question here about lobbying activity reports. The question is, how is participation in a lobbying activity defined? Does this include only individuals present for meetings or sending signed letters under their names, or does it extend to staff that may provide admin support for these meetings and other communications? And so the answer to that is a lobbying activity is defined as communicating with a public office holder. So you actually have to be either present at that meeting or sending an email or a letter if you have some admin support to prep yourself to send that letter, that person would not need to be included as an in-house lobbyist and would not need to be included in that lobbying activity report.
Okay. There is a question here about social media posts and whether or not they are considered lobbying. So can we clarify that if you tag government officials, is that considered lobbying? And the answer to that question is yes. When you tag a government official at their official government account, then you are falling within the definition of what it means to lobby, which is communicating with a public office holder. And of course, the caveat there is that the contents of your social media post need to be lobbying content. So you need to be trying to influence them on any of the matters set out in the definition of lobbying in order for that to be something that you would need to register in the Lobbyists Registry. And that's a new area for us. It's something that our office is thinking a lot about. But as it stands now, yes, a communication directly with a public office holder that is an attempt to influence them on any of the matters in the definition of lobbying would have to be submitted to the registry.
So we have a question here about how the organization actually registers. Question is, do we register the organization or under the name of the in-house lobbyist? So the organization just has one registration return, and it is the responsibility of the designated filer. That is the person defined in legislation as the most senior paid person for the organization to register the organization and to list all of the in-house lobbyists. So each in-house lobbyist does not have a separate registration return. It's all in one return, and it's managed and updated by the designated filer. And they list all of their in-house lobbyists and all of the in-house lobbyist lobbying activities.
Thanks, Morag. And I think we actually now have about time for 2 more questions before we need to wrap. So
okay,
back to look at the 2 most popular questions.
There's actually a good one here. It doesn't have specifics, but I'm going to talk about it a bit because it's an important question. So the question is participating in a government stakeholder meeting or group considered lobbying if the government invites the organization to participate? So this goes back to the exception, or I should say exclusion, that I talked about, where your organization may receive a written request from government to contribute submissions to something, and it may be set up as a stakeholder consultation, or it may have some other format. It's really important that you keep a copy of that written invite for you to attend. And what you want to understand is that when you are participating in that, you're providing your expertise as solicited by that public office holder. However, if you were to take advantage of the opportunity presented by being in that forum to lobby a public office holder on a different matter that your organization has a campaign on, for example, then that's something that you would need to declare in the Lobbyists Registry as part of your lobbying activity report. So you just need to keep in mind that when you are receiving a written invitation, then your submissions need to be related to that invitation. And again, as the registrar said, there's nothing wrong if you want to do lobbying in that forum as well. You just need to declare those activities in the registry. It's part of ensuring that they're transparent.
And our final question here is about grassroots lobbying. The question is, if a nonprofit membership-based social agency launches a campaign to influence a minister and asks their members to send an email or letter to that minister. So like I said, this is called grassroots lobbying, and it's not captured in BC's lobbying legislation. It is captured in some other legislations in Canada, but not in BC's. So in BC, the organization has to be having their in-house lobbyists communicate directly with public office holders. If they have a campaign where they encourage members of the public to write to the minister, that is not considered lobbying and is not captured in BC's legislation, and you would not need to declare that.
Thanks, Morag. There are a lot more questions, and some of them have been provided anonymously. Those we will look at too. I think if there's something in our guidance that we need to fill in the blanks on. Those which are not anonymous and we're be able to contact, we will deal with those offline. And as I mentioned at the beginning, our office, both Morag and Oline, are available to answer questions, and Allison as well on our team. And we would encourage you to do that. We recognize the work you do is incredibly important to our community. That there's more to the work that you do than simply lobbying or registering with under the LRA, and we really do appreciate that. We do think, as I said at the beginning, that once you get the hang of the system, it's pretty easy to use, user-friendly from the lobbyist point of view, but also from the public's access as well. So, and again, I wanted to thank Allison. I think she's out there, and appreciate you reaching out to make this contact to set this up today. This will not be our last conversation about these issues, and I expect we'll have a number more going forward. And again, we would encourage you to get a hold of us. Just so you know as well, these things happen because people organize them, and we have people behind the scenes in the control room, Michelle Mitchell and Noelle Boivin on our team, and I want to thank them for helping do the technical end of this. This is, I think, our first one on Microsoft Teams. And we've moved over from the Zoom technology. This is somewhat more secure, and I think it seems to be even a more stable technology. So be interested in anybody out there has feedback, use this, or has their own feedback about how the afternoon has gone. So again, thank you all very much. We will be in touch, and I wish you all well in the work that you do. Take care. Bye for now.